This is a ManeHustle Media podcast.
Hey y'all, this is Javi Nicole, aka your favorite lesbian, and you're listening to Black Radical Queer Podcast, our stories on our own terms. Hey y'all, thanks so much for tuning in to Black Radical Queer Podcast. For this episode, I actually decided to split it up into two parts. So you'll get to hear the first half of my conversation with Karen here. And if you are a Patreon, then you can go ahead and have access to part two early. If not, then next week you'll hear part two to our conversation. We had a really great conversation and we went a bit long on time. So instead of cutting out our conversation, I decided to just split it up so that you all could hear it all. So tune in to the first part now and then look out for the second part next week. Or if you're a Patreon or you become a Patreon, then you can go ahead and have access to it ASAP. All right. Thanks so much for listening. We are, of course, back with another episode of Black Radical Queer Podcast, and I have another guest on with me today that I'm very excited to talk to. I was already like reading a lot of his writing, but I specifically kind of honed in on a few things, on a few articles that I wanted to focus on, some things that he had written recently because they were just so timely. And I felt like they would be really good to bring to the listeners. But in the interest of time, I've decided I need to kind of like narrow it down and not try to focus on all the things because I was reading and I'm like, oh, I want to go focus on this one. And then I read the next one, like, oh, I want to focus on this one. So got to rein that in a little bit. So before we get into our conversation, I'm going to allow my guest to introduce himself. And also, I did already share a link to his writing on the BRQ Facebook page. So that way, listeners can go and read what he's written. So you can kind of be all caught up like I am and understand why I had such a tough time trying to figure out what I wanted to focus on for this specific conversation. So go ahead and get started. You can plug whatever you want to plug. If there's anything you have coming up, you can, let everybody know, and then we will get into our conversation.
Hey, hi. My name's Kieran Scarlett. I am a queer Black filmmaker and culture writer based in Los Angeles. I've been doing a lot of work for Rewire News recently, and they're a great publication. Their primary focus is on reproductive health and immigration, and they're sort of allowing me to write a lot of stuff for their culture section, which has been really interesting and a lot of fun. And it's a great outlet. And I'm also launching a podcast called This Made Me Queer with Kyle Turner, who is another queer writer, and he's based in New York. And it should be launching sometime later this summer. And it's sort of a very loose conversation where we give each other cultural access points that maybe maybe one of us is familiar with, but the other one isn't. And we sort of talk about how it was an important part of our pop culture queer narrative. And we just thought it was important because we have a lot of these conversations in the queer community, but it's so dominated by cisgender white men. So I think that having it between two people of color kind of puts a different spin on it. And I think we're both in those spaces, be it virtually or like actually writing for publications where we're around a lot of white cisgender men, and the way they sort of inadvertently take up space and perpetuate this narrative of starvation in terms of their representation, where they are suddenly a oppressed minority.
That's hilarious. Yeah.
And well, not to us, sweetie. And also, we're not just here to write about Black stuff, even though we should be writing about Black stuff before you, because y'all can write about it.
Right.
But I know it's just sort of carving out our space in that pop culture conversation, which I think pop culture is personal. Let's say the way that you say the political is personal. Like, I think pop culture access points are personal, And I love
absolutely.
I love the way people like Janet Mock write about pop culture and specifically how it relates to her upbringing and her milestones. And, I think we need more voices like that and not just white queer men, which is what it's mostly made up of.
Right. No, that's real. I do think all those things are intertwined. Like a lot of times people try to look at it as so compartmentalized when in reality, we can't look at things like pop culture or politics or whatever as being separate from us personally, because they are a lot of times representation. So you look at pop culture, that is media representation. Like that is, whether it's music, whether it's movies, whether it's television, whatever it is, there is some type of way that we connect or don't connect to it, which a lot of times is the issue, is that, okay, I don't see my personal, the things that are personal to me and my identity reflected in that, or the things that kind of connect you to a certain time, like, okay, during this time in my life, this is what was happening in pop culture. So all of that is relevant, and it is something that is heavily dominated by cishet white folks, especially cishet white men who are like, you know, the quote unquote authorities. And I'm just like, there's other segments of people who you have no way of knowing how this relates to us. You just don't, you can't tell that story. You just can't. So
totally. I listen to a lot of political podcasts, and it's funny to me how it'll be 3 white people usually, and it's usually two cishet white men and 1 cishet white woman. Like that's usually the formula that I've noticed on like 3 of the podcasts I listen to. And it's so funny, they'll have these conversations where they're talking about, like, say, poor people, and they're talking about poor people in the abstract. And I'm like, you know, you guys, you could have an actual poor person on your podcast. Or like there are journalists who grew up, like none of y'all grew up poor. There are journalists who grew up poor. There are journalists of color who grew up poor. And you guys are talking about this like it's an impossible thing to figure out what poor people are thinking,
it's like,
what their motivations might be.
Subject.
Exactly.
You know?
But they're given freedom to write about us as objects with objectivity, you know, where they're like this objective voice that's observing us, and they're also objectifying us. And it's like, it's almost like they think we can't speak, or they don't want to hear from us. They don't want to hear from us even about ourselves. And it's so frustrating. And
right. They just want to hear from other people like them, what they think of us, or what they think we're like, or what their interpretation of us like. I don't want to hear from an actual Black person. I just want to hear what white people say about like what a white person's interpretation or vision or stereotype or whatever of a Black person is, or a queer person of color or whatever, which is it's not like it's surprising per se, but it's also ridiculous. Like, it's also unacceptable too, because they just cannot, even though they have this misconception that they can tell those stories, and that's been reinforced. It's been backed up by privilege. I mean, that's the part of their privilege, that they get to be the narrators, you know, of stories that are not theirs, and I'm just not here for it.
Yeah, and not to get too off base, but this way in which, you know, we are not surprised, but they're surprised, and they don't talk to anyone other than people like themselves. It's why all these journalists were caught with their pants down when Hillary Clinton lost the election to a racist steak salesman. Like, you know, I think a lot of, like, when I think about the people, the Black journalists I follow, especially Black women, it was like Melissa Harris Perry and
yes,
and like Bim Adewimne from BuzzFeed, and I'm blanking. I think even like Jamie Nesbitt Golden was talking about this. These are all Black women who were predicting that Trump was going to win. And Melissa Harris Perry talked all the time about how she knew that Trump was going to win, and she was working at Elle at the time, and she had some power there, and she still couldn't get a piece placed where she was talking about how she thought Trump was going to win, because it didn't feel good for Elle to run a piece like that, and it didn't play into the narrative that everyone was trying to play into, which is that, oh, this can't happen because what will it say about America if he gets elected, and we can't go there as white people who think that we've overcome all this shit. And, you know, he's been elected now, and so what does it say about America?
It says exactly what we already knew.
That's what we have been saying.
It says exactly what we already knew, and so we're just kind of like, okay, well, you know, now you get some kind of slight glimpse, because it's still nothing in comparison. You know, they're freaking the hell out, and we're just like, oh, this is just another day. You know, my life has not drastically changed because of this, because we've been dealing with this shit.
Yeah,
so now you are looking at it differently. You know, now you're freaking out and, oh my God, it's the apocalypse. And I'm just like, oh, that's cute. You know.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Let's take my black ass to work.
like how they all freak out, Javia, about Facebook is selling our information. It's like, child, Black people have been surveilled by the government. Okay.
Hello. Like, if you really want to go there, I'm just like, so it's like funny but not funny, but it's just so crazy to me to see the things that they get worked up over. And I'm just like, we've been dealing with this. Like, really, you new to this? You know, we've been either lab rats or experimenting, you know, all those kind of things. So it's like, you freaking out about that stuff. We're just like, oh, that's old news to us. We're facing some, like, now we're just like looking at them and just kind of do the where you shake your head like, oh baby, all right, they, you know, they really think they're going through it.
I try to allow for space for in good faith white people who are genuinely horrified and just didn't know before, because you know what, no one comes out of the womb, you know, knowing about systemic oppression and, you know, intersecting systems of, you know, racism and stuff like that. No one comes out of the womb knowing about stuff like that. But at the same time, it's like, it's so basic sometimes, like with this whole thing of Trump holding children in cages or Trump's administration holding children in cages, where it's like, this is not America. Like, how it's like, do you know how our ancestors, my ancestors were brought to this continent? Like, do you know how that happened?
Like, do you even history? Like, what are you talking about? This is the same song. Are you kidding?
And this was going on under Obama, by the way. Like, let's be clear. Maybe not to this degree, but it just kept getting worse. Like, people are like, oh, Obama was the president who deported the most people under his administration. I'm like, yeah, of course he was, because every president becomes that president. You know, they all deport the most number of people because we just keep getting more and more.
Right.
It's about keeping brown people out of this country.
Decreasing. Right. Exactly. So it's math. Like, that's just how it works.
Yeah. But anyways, I could yell about white liberals all day.
So, but no, what I had to just kind of narrow it down to in terms of one of your Rewire articles that I want to talk about for this particular episode was actually in relation to Pose. It was hard. Okay. It was hard to choose, because I call myself trying to narrow it down by saying, okay, I'm only going to focus on these articles. Like, I'm not going to try to pull way back or whatever. I'm like, let me just look at like the few most recent. And that didn't make it easier. But I do feel like that one in particular is very near and dear to my heart, because it's something that I talk about a lot. And it's something that my wife and I have talked about a lot when it comes to queer representation and Black queer love and relationships, and just all those things being so infused with trauma. And when I look at, you know, these representations that I do hold near and dear to my heart, like Moonlight and like Pariah, that were so groundbreaking for me personally, it's always with that kind of caveat that there's this tragic quality to them. There's this, and not saying that is untrue per se, but it also is very limited. We don't get the same breadth and the same nuance and scope that white people get in terms of kind of portraying their queer romances and their love stories, and this sense of hope and optimism and even carefree, like just being carefree. So that is something that really stood out to me, because it's not something that we get. I look at those portrayals and those stories, they do ring true, but we also don't get that balance of being able to have the carefree representation, that kind of thing there. It is always infused and intertwined with trauma.
Yeah, totally. And I'm glad that you made the point, which I was trying to make in the piece, which is that it's not that I'm saying that we shouldn't have Pose or Moonlight or Pariah. Of course, I'm not saying, like, I love, first of all, I love some of those things, and I at the very least like all of them. But I just think that constantly being receptacles for trauma on screen, it really says a lot about how queer people of color, especially queer Black people, it says a lot to how our experiences are so linked to trauma, which they often are. But that's not the entirety of our experience. Like, even someone who has been traumatized, like, that's not the entirety of their experience in real life. You know, they have moments where they experience joy and where they get to be carefree. And I also think that another big problem I have with it in a lot of these narratives with Black people is that the cruelty and the trauma is often at the hands of other Black people, which is also true and reflective of what can often happen, especially in families. But I think it's a way in which we perpetuate this narrative that Black people are more homophobic than white people, which is not true, or that Black queer people mostly experience rejection and being ostracized by other Black people, which is also not true. I think that it absolves white people, especially white cishet queer people, both men and women, of the role they play in ostracizing queer people of color.
Mm-hmm. And the fact that they set the tone for, or not completely set tone, but they did. I mean, when we look at our history and we look at kind of the implications and the byproducts of white supremacy, a lot of those things that oppression, it's just kind of that basis for a lot of the oppression. So they don't get to be exempt from the responsibility that they have in that. So I do think it is a very problematic narrative for it to be like, well, Black people don't accept queerness, or they ostracize their queer, loved ones and stuff like that. And not saying that never happens, but it doesn't happen more than it does with white queer people. Like, it's not like, oh, well, Black parents kick their kids out more than white. Like, that is just untrue. It's not true. But that
so
is
untrue.
That's the narrative that's put out there, that Black people are so unaccepting of. And I'm just like, that has not, of course, like, I've had, issues or whatever with that, but that has not been the entirety of the experience. And Black people have just not been less accepting than white people. It's just not true. But that it just kind of ties into this broader narrative of kind of painting people of color and painting Black people to be a very specific way and to be very flat, and for us not to be allowed to have nuance, and for there not to be room for more things other than trauma. So it's like our trauma. And so that includes families being very rigid and not accepting, and very religious, and just kind of demonizing their children or whatever. All of that plays into this whole idea of how bad it is, how traumatic it is to be Black and to be Black and queer, and to kind of that be your identity. It's like, oh, it's so devastating, and it's such a tragedy. But there is beauty. Like, there's beauty in Blackness, there's beauty in Black queerness, but that is not what we are shown. We're shown trauma porn. And we do go through trauma. We do, but that is not the entirety of our identities either. Like, the entirety of my identity as a Black queer person is not trauma.
Yeah, exactly. And also, to circle back to something you were saying about this notion that Black parents kick out their children more, or that Black people they reject queerness more. I think that's, like, to sort of position that as socially and culturally and historically, as a fact, that's really violent and inaccurate, because
it is.
It's been proven, and there's historical evidence to support this, that a lot of cultures before they were interacted with by European colonizers and settlers had a lot more progressive ideas about both sexuality and gender before they were touched by European settlers, and before we were taken as slaves from Africa, and we had this Christian doctrine, beaten and raped into us.
Yeah, it's before we got infused with that respectability, the whole respectability politics, and this is what you have to do to be a good, decent Christian person. And it's a byproduct of that, which is why it's so, it is very deliberate. It is a very deliberate form of oppression to paint Black people out to be that way, to be like, oh, Black folks don't accept that. Or even this whole idea of, I talked about this with another guest with the episode that just dropped, where we were talking about, oh, such and such is some white people stuff. And it's like, well, actually, no, that's not true. But that's what we've been conditioned to believe, that white people get to be nuanced and we don't get to be nuanced, and we don't get to be accepting and loving and all that we're just put in this box of being negative.
I think this was this the episode I listened to last night where you guys were talking about Tantra?
Yes. Mm-hmm. So on that episode where we're saying a lot of times, people of color, we don't feel like we have access to certain things because we say, oh, that's for white people. In reality, it's a lot of times that it comes from us, but we've been taught to believe that we can't do things like that. Like, we don't do things like that. And that's not what we should do to try to be as seen as kind of good people. Like, we need to be as respectable and regular and vanilla as possible, so that we can, and really it just ties into our humanity, we feel like these are the things we have to do to be seen as human, because that's what we've been told. We've been told, okay, you're animals, and if you want to be a good, decent person, this is how you need to live your life, so that you even have some type of slight remote possibility of us seeing you as human, of you being humanized and not being objectified. So it's definitely not true. It's not true, though. It's definitely not true that that we're less accepting. I've just found that to just totally not be true. But that is definitely the narrative that is pushed out.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you were saying about the perception, oh, that's white people stuff. It starts with stuff like, Tantra or yoga, and then it trickles down to stuff that everyone would at least benefit from. I'm not going to say what everyone should be doing, but stuff like therapy, where it's oh, therapy, that's
right.
There's still this, I don't want to put her on blast too much, but I just remember casually mentioning to my mom over the phone, that I was considering going to therapy. And I didn't say again, because I guess she doesn't know that I had been before, but it was this sort of quiet, and she's like, okay. And then she called me back 10 minutes later, and she's like, I just want to make sure you're okay. And I'm like, yeah, I mean, I'm fine. And she's like, oh, because you said you're going to go to therapy. And I was just surprised that there's still this fear of therapy, and I think it is viewed as something that white people do and that white people have access to, and I think that some people often view it as almost like, oh, that's like an indulgence. It's like, oh, look at them with their,
it's a luxury thing, yeah,
their organic produce and their
and their therapy and their yoga
and their exactly and their therapy, where it's like, well, organic produce is good, it shouldn't be expensive, therapy is good, therapy should not be expensive, these should not be white people things, these should be human things. And also, white people didn't invent any of these things.
Right. That is something that is nuanced in terms of kind of how Black people and how people of color, or Black people in particular, view therapy. Because on one hand, it is looked at as like, oh, that's something that white people do. And a lot of it is because we have been conditioned to work through whatever we're going through. So if we are struggling mentally or emotionally or whatever, we're supposed to just keep pushing. So we are supposed to be like the workhorses. So there's that. We're also supposed to not display that. Like, it's like, okay, that's stuff that you keep to yourself. Like, you have stuff to do, so we're not allowed to show emotional nuance. And it's also seen as something that's weak, like, oh, well, especially in regards to religion, like, okay, well, that's something that you pray about. That's something that your faith should take care of. So there's like all those things that are operating, plus just distrust of the medical industry anyway, which is completely valid, considering how treated, So it's kind of like all those things operating, where it's like, I can completely, even as someone who is in human services, who is in mental health, I can completely understand someone being like, I don't want to talk to some white man about my problems. That's completely valid. I don't either, girl. I don't either. So I get that, because we need more folks in the field too who are people of color. And there are plenty, there are people of color in the field, but a lot of times, because we look at it as, oh, well, this is a white people thing, we don't see ourselves reflected in the field either. We go to the doctor, we go to these people, they're largely white men. And I don't trust them either. So I don't want to go to therapy if I feel like my vision of it is I'm on the couch talking to some white man who's taking notes about what I'm going through. I don't want him in my business. So it's like, is that operating in addition to the, oh, well, you're supposed to work through it and be tough and be strong, because, we don't get to be emotional or nuanced. And you're supposed to use your faith. Like, your faith is what you should fall back on. Because God forbid you have faith and therapy. Like, it's like they can't coexist. So we're kind of navigating all these different nuances in regards to like us seeking out therapy and just us doing things for our own mental and emotional well-being.
Yeah, totally. And what you were saying about not wanting to go to a white therapist or a white practitioner of any sort of medical treatment, it's like, if they can almost kill Serena Williams in childbirth, a woman with all the resources and all the access, like, what's going to happen to, I mean, obviously I would never be giving birth because I'm a cisgender male, but like, what would happen theoretically?
Like my regular self. Yeah.
Like, what would happen to my regular Black ass? And also similarly, I have a friend, he's a queer man of color, and he was telling me about his new therapist, and he mentioned that he was a white man. I'm like, oh, it was so alien to me. And he's like, oh, but he's gay. I'm like, yeah, I don't care. First of all, A, I'm not talking to a man, like, period. And B, like, the idea of sitting down and talking to a white male therapist, I feel like you have to be able to open up to the person. And I feel like that's the one area where we need to be selfish in who we're choosing. And yeah, and I think that there should be, I know that there's more of this now, but like more networks where they're giving people of color access to networks where it's specifically, therapists of color. And for women of color, if you specifically want to go to a Black woman, because I know that a lot of my Black women friends, they're not comfortable going to anyone but a Black woman. And that completely makes sense given their experience. No,
I think that's definitely true. I mean, I am glad to see that more of those things are kind of coming to fruition, and we're starting to get those resources. But of course, of course, we need them on a larger scale. And it's going to take some time to kind of like catch up, because we are in desperate, dire need of mental health resources and just healthcare resources in general. And but I do see that need is being met more and more, slowly but surely. So that is something that is really, really important, because it is, I mean, when it comes to your care, of course, that's a trust thing. Like, you are entrusting someone to be responsible for that and to really have your best interests at mind. And I'm just not the one in terms of like, I can't trust a white man to have my best interests at heart. I just can't. I just cannot. So it's like, that just is what it is. So we need to be able to connect with our practitioners in that way. Not like we have to be BFFs, but there is a certain level of intimacy and connection that we need to be able to establish that rapport and that trust that, okay, I can really count on this person and in regards to my care, because that's your well-being, that is largely in someone else's hands. It's in your hands, but you're also relying on this person as a resource. So that's really important. And we talked about that too in another episode when I talked to Zay. Yeah, it just kind of like shows us like how important it is that we do have those people that we can connect with, because I can totally understand not seeking it out. And of course, that's not the only reason. So it's like some of the reasons I'm like, okay, we have our unpacking we need to do, but that reason in particular, I'm like, yeah, I get it. I get why, you're kind of giving the side eye. Like, I'm not going to therapy if your perspective of it is that you're talking to some white guy, you sit on the couch and, even though that is a outdated kind of perception of therapy. But if that's all then I can understand that.
And if more people, it's like, this is a weird comparison, but it's like voting. If more people had access to it, if more people could afford to do it, people literally can't afford to take a day off to vote. If there was fair access to it, more people would do it, which is why there isn't access to it, right? Because, a class of Black people of all socioeconomic backgrounds who are having access to therapy, who are able to vote without any sort of, impediment, like that means the end for a lot of white supremacist institutions, honestly. If we are if our mental health and our physical well-being and our ability to vote in free elections was ensured, like
game changers.
They would
Those are some game changers.
it would change things in a way that they know, which is why they deny us access to these things,
that's very much like, hey, this is oppression at work and it's working well type of thing, because resources and accessibility is everything. Accessibility is everything. So once you have access to some stuff, it changes. And people can see how that operates in their own everyday lives. So, I see the difference now in my life there are things now that I have access to that I didn't. It changes everything. It really does. So, that's well known. So it is very deliberate that we have these issues around accessibility and our resources, because it's to keep us where we are and to keep that progress from happening, because we already see in history, we can look at how kind of people of color have advanced and stuff like that. If we have some shit, if we have the accessibility that we need, it's over. We're going to get it done. So it's not whether or not we can isn't the issue, but it's like having the access to everything that we need to get it done. That's where they get us.
Yeah. And that's why I wrote that piece about Pose in particular, because I think it's not just actual access, it's access in terms of the narrative that we're selling to children, where like I remember telling my parents that I wanted to, be a filmmaker. I entered college as an accounting major to sort of appease them. And I was like, I'm going to make a movie after I graduated from college. They're like, but what are you going to do? I'm like, I will find some kind of job to support myself while I'm making this movie. Mm-hmm. And they're like, but who's going to see this movie? And I got really angry. But looking back, I'm like, they are coming from a perspective of they don't let people like us they don't let people who look like us do stuff like that. Mm-hmm. People who look like us don't have access to those spaces. And I'm still, I've made inroads. I'm still writing. I'm still submitting. But like I've been paid to write. I've been paid to write scripts. And it's so wild. My parents, well, I don't talk to my dad so much, but my family has sort of eased up on that a little bit, my immediate family. But I still get it from extended family where they're like, so like, what are you doing? Or they'll read. Or
like, what are you really doing?
Or they'll read an article that I wrote. They're like, wow, you're a really good writer. And I'm like, what do you think? Yes, I am a good writer. What do you think?
This is what I do.
What do you think I've been doing for the past like 20 years, pretty much? Like, what do you think? I've just been chilling out here going to the beach?
Right.
Like they don't see.
But no, that is a lot of times that is what they think though. Mm-hmm. That's funny though. It's like, this is what the fuck I do. But that's a whole other thing because that kind of ties into, just what's seen as valid and what's not seen as valid, and what's seen as work, So it's like, okay, well, certain things, if you say, oh, well, I'm a doctor, that's one thing. If you say I'm a writer, it's not looked at the same way, even though there's this impact and this influence that writers have that doctors don't. Writers shape a lot of things, they shape a cultural narrative. That's really, really powerful. But it's just kind of the way that we look at certain things, certain industries and jobs and careers or stuff are more valid than others.
Yeah, and valid, and I think honorable is a good word. Where like, I made a movie. I directed a movie with John Henry, who I think from Vox. But we directed this movie and it played in Atlanta.
I'm like, I remember. And I was like, yeah, I remember John Henry.
Yeah, the movie played in Atlanta, like at an actual movie theater. And not so much my mom, because I think my mom got on board with the whole filmmaker thing before that. But especially with my dad, who is very much, focused on appearances and sort of like how he can get into rooms and be impressive to people. But like him seeing the fact that I made a movie and him actually being able to see the movie, I think that was the first time he actually respected the fact that I was trying to do this. And suddenly he was giving me a whole bunch of advice, like, oh, you should go work with Tyler Perry or something like that. I'm like, oh. But it's like until they're
no, Dad, I shouldn't.
Exactly. But until they're able to see it in a form that they sort of recognize, it's not valid or honorable to them. Whereas like a doctor, you don't have to go and audition and like make it in a big sort of way to be a doctor. Like you don't, like when people hear I'm going to be a doctor, they're like, okay, there's a clear path to that. You go to college for 4 years. You go, I don't know, whatever. I haven't watched Grey's Anatomy in a long time, so I don't remember the exact sequence of college, but of schooling for doctors. But
like the go-to resource.
But like it's clear, lawyer, it's clear. You go to college, you go to law school. But with a writer, it's like, okay, you go to college and you get a writing degree or you get a communications degree or something. And then what? It's not like there's a clear path into being able to support yourself as a writer. And I was thinking about that a lot with when I wrote the Pose piece, and I mentioned Love, Simon, where Love, Simon is about this white teenager who's coming out, and it takes place in Atlanta, which really surprised me. I didn't realize that till the end.
That surprised me too. I actually did not realize that. I was like, this is supposed to not my Atlanta, like really? I
didn't realize it until the end where they pulled back, and I'm like, that's Atlanta,
right?
Like that's not even Atlanta. They're trying to play out.
Be set? Was it just like filmed there and was it actually supposed to be set in Atlanta?
I checked. I Googled, and it's set in Atlanta. I think it's based on a book that's set in Atlanta, I believe, too.
Oh, it didn't feel like Atlanta to me at all. I knew it was filmed there because what isn't in between LA and Atlanta, everything. But yeah, I'm like, this is not. It's interesting. Like Atlanta specifically, maybe like a smaller town.
Yeah.
No, not even. I don't know. That was interesting.
And like, yeah, even a school. But like, anyway, but. There are two characters in that movie. There are two queer characters of color in that movie. And, they're not experiencing trauma, and they're not sort of being ostracized by their families, but they're also stripped of any sort of narrative agency. And they're sort of, in one case, it's one character who's completely like it seems like he's asexual, and he's like the one openly gay kid in school. Mm-hmm. And Simon doesn't even entertain the possibility that it might be him, because like, oh, I could never be with someone like that. Black, femme, pressed hair. No, it's not.
Yeah.
And so we're either receptacles for trauma, or
just have no narrative at all,
or we have no narrative at all, or we're like the kiki friend, And I just like, I would love to see us centered in a regular, average-ass movie like Love, Simon, because not everything that centers us has to be great either. We have this burden that everything we create, everything we put out about ourselves has to be great and has to be this great artistic statement. Like, we have to have freedom for mediocrity within our ranks as well. And I don't mean mediocrity in the sense that like we're not talented. I mean, we have to be able to tell, commercial stories and mainstream stories.
Right. It doesn't always have to, exactly. Not just the extreme, not just the extreme of like trauma, regardless of the truth in it. I still just need to see, like, I need to be able to turn on the TV and I can see a story of two Black queer guys that are just like, we're in love, we're being carefree, we're doing ridiculous shit. It doesn't matter. Like, I still need that too. Everything doesn't have to be so quote unquote deep. It doesn't have to be, I'm facing this major dilemma. I Sometimes I just want to see them going on about their black ass, queer ass lives, picking out some fucking linens and shit because they just got a house and they're like, oh, we're about to decorate and we just got, we're starting a family, whatever. I want to see those stories too. It doesn't always have to be some huge either thing about oppression, like about slavery or about violence against us and all those kind of things, or how our families don't accept us. Sometimes I really just want to see Black people, Black queer people just living regular ass lives, because we do that too. I mean, we have families, we have households, we go out on dates, we have sex, we do all those things. So I just want to see like Black queer people. I want to see queer people of color existing in that way too, like just regular. It's not normalized because we're seen as the others. And I just want to see those everyday portrayals because we do live those lives.
Yeah, and I think about the times we do see Black queer people in sort of regular, quote unquote, average situations that's not all about their oppression. They're paired with white people. They're paired with a white partner. Because it's almost like, oh, two Black people can't have that on their own. Like
that's the only way to have access to it is through a white partner.
Yeah, in The Family Stone, which is this movie that came out in 2005 with Diane Keaton and Sarah Jessica Parker. One of the brothers in that movie is gay, and he has a Black partner, and they're all very accepting of him because they're white liberals, and the daughter carries an NPR tote bag, and it's almost like he's there for Christmas. There's no mention of his family. He's part of their family, because it's almost like, oh, you could never have two queer Black people who have that. I love Moonlight. I think Moonlight might end up being my favorite movie of all time. That movie just hit me on every level, but also not everything needs to be that. Not everything needs to be a Black kid getting picked on so badly that he has to pick up a chair and smash it over the bullies, which gave me so much life.
Or everything doesn't have to be like this, where there's this thing lingering. Moonlight, it's so fucking beautiful, and it has this like, it's hauntingly beautiful to me. Like, I mean, I remember watching it and like, I mean, to this day, my wife and I still like talk about it all the time, but I was having dreams about it. Like, I could not get it out my head. It stuck to me so, because it was the thing that resonated with me the most, even though these were men. Still, this was the thing, like, for my Black queer self, that resonated with me in a very deep way. But I just remember being it being bittersweet, because it's beautiful, it's haunting, and but I just remember at the end, and I'm like, I want them to be able to have a love story, like an actual love story, that's not so drenched in this haunting, like, without it being so haunting, or without it being so much violence and pain and trauma. Like, I'm just looking at them like, okay, well, they deserve a love story too. Like, they deserve carefree moments too. Like, so it just it was a bittersweet thing. It's still fucking amazing. Like, even thinking about it now, like, it blows my mind. I don't know if anything else any other like cinematic thing has impacted me the way that it did, but it's still, at the end, I just remember really craving that. I'm like, I want us to have that too. And it was similar, not quite on the same, to the same degree with Pariah. I did definitely identify kind of with the main character. I love her, but it didn't hit me quite as hard as Moonlight. But in both stories, I just remember being like, I want to see them have joy, not just trauma, and not just like this kind of anticlimactic. I don't know. I just really wanted to see them have some joy, and it be very carefree and very bold. And so that was something that I didn't get from either one of those. That really was like sad. It was really sad to me.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that what Pariah and Moonlight have in common is that they both leave you with, if not uplift, they both leave you with the possibility that joy is coming in the future. Mm-hmm. Where Alike and Pariah, she's going off to college. Her mother has cut her off, but that's not always permanent. That could always change. And I think Alika definitely left space open for her mother and her father. And I think that her and her sister, but she's going off to, I think, Berkeley. And you know that she's going to kill it there. You know that she's going to have all these experiences there that are going to shape her life. And she's also going to have to push back on a lot of stuff. And similarly in Moonlight, it's complicated. Kevin has a son. Chiron has his own demons to deal with. And what I also felt like with Moonlight, you get this idea that, but they're still going to be cloaked in secrecy, because even though Kevin's not with his wife anymore, and Chiron has so much trauma to work through, I feel like, before he can even be in a relationship with anyone, because he even says in the movie, he's like, no one ever touched me other than you.
Right.
And that was deliberate. Like, that, him being touched by someone who then the next day betrayed him, that really fucked him up. And and he has to work through that. All that's possible, but will it happen? We don't know. But there's not like that uplift where it's not Love, Simon where they kiss on a Ferris wheel at the end,
Exactly, where it's like, it's almost the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of uplift. You know what I mean? It's like they kiss, now they're, riding around together. Now he's, like his boyfriend is like in the passenger side, and, his friends in the back and blah. So it's a different level. With both, though, with Pariah and with Moonlight, like you said, we are left with this kind of glimmer of possibility. But with Pariah, with Alike going off to Berkeley, my thought process was just like, okay, well, if she does have that, look where she had to be. Look where she has to go for that. So we're still not seeing it. And so we're still not seeing it in the midst of her community, in the midst of her people. It's like she has to go off to Berkeley to have the possibility of this joy and this, of her living her life. That saddens me. Or even with Chiron, and Lord knows, like these are, of course, like characters. But when I say, I feel like these are people that I know and that it's really, and that a lot of ways I feel like I can just relate to very personally. But with Chiron, it was so, I don't know, it just has this very tragic air to it, because like you said, he does have a lot of stuff he needs to work through. And so I didn't even get the same depth of kind of optimism like with Alike, because with Chiron, I just felt like, okay, there's this moment. It just felt very momentary to me, very like in that specific moment, but it was hard to really see the trajectory of it. Because her going off to college, it's like, okay, that's still kind of there's more openness. But in that situation with Chiron and Kevin, it's like, I just didn't feel even that level of openness.
The obstacles to happiness for Chiron and Kevin feel a lot more stacked against them, honestly.
It's like, it's for them, it's stacked against them. And look where they are, though. They're still kind of in their community. With Alike, in order for it not to be so stacked against her, she has to leave her people. She has to leave her community. And that just really fucked with me. Like that really, it saddened me and it really bothered me, because I was just like, from my experience, that has not been the case. That's not just like a blanket thing where it's like, okay, well, the only way for you to be able to have more of that possibility of joy is for you to remove yourself and for you to not be in the spaces with your people. So that was
especially since Alike lives in New York, doesn't she?
Right. So I'm just like, really? That's some bullshit. Like, come on now. New York is thrive, You
have to go all the way to Berkeley?
Right. Like for real, in order for her to like live her life, she has to go all the way to Berkeley.
Yeah, it was very, I noticed that too. And also with Love, Simon, where, you have him ending up with this biracial black classmate. And, so you have his biracial female friend played by Alexandra Shipp and the other biracial friend and the only fully black person, not that this, but like just to talk about colorism. And like, it's almost like these people have to be steeped in whiteness in order to be part of his core culture in a way, and in order to be part of his social group, rather. And he chooses this black boy, and it's like, okay, so this is a white guy and a black guy dating in an Atlanta high school. Let's talk about that. Let's go there.
Right. Come on now, because it is not all sunshines and rainbows.
Exactly. Which makes it sound like I want to see trauma. It's like, I don't need to see trauma, but I need to see honesty about how it's how the dynamics of this work, because that's definitely something to navigate. And also,
that was the opportunity to explore that was not utilized. Well, but my thing is, okay, either you're gonna explore it, right? Like actually take advantage of the opportunity, or just give me a fucking bubblegum ass film. Just do that. If it's not gonna, if we don't get to see all that nuance, then don't give me any nuance with anybody. Just let them run off into the fucking sunset. And I don't need to get all this nuance about Simon's ass either. That's exactly fine. If it's going to be that, let it be that carefree love story. There's nothing stacked against them. There's no issues. It's all perfect and beautiful. That's fine. I'm okay with that. But the discrepancy is where the issue comes in. Like if that's how you're going to treat it, then just treat it like that across the board. But if not, then I need to see the nuance across the board too, whichever way you're going to do it. It is similar to what you were talking about in it's a different article, but it's where you were talking about the Roseanne situation. But like just looking at the show, like Roseanne initially versus, and I felt similarly because I actually did used to rock with Roseanne back in the day until I realized that it was problematic. But it's this lack of nuance, like you were talking about, well, the characters of color versus like the white characters and who got these full storylines, and looking at her supposed friends, her white friends, we got to know about their lives, and her friends of color, supposed to be her friends, they were just like props. They were just like, oh, they would, throw a catchphrase in there every now and then, but we didn't get to know about their marriages and their children and what their likes and dislikes were and stuff like that. So we didn't get the depth. And so that's my thing with Love, Simon. If that's the case, if you wanted to have this very like sugary sweet type of ending and everything's all fine and well, that is perfectly fine with me. Then just make the whole thing that way and don't give me this depth on this white boy. And then I get no kind of nuance with that is definitely would be there in that situation, like in an interracial gay male relationship in Atlanta, all this kind of stuff. Like the most nuance that they gave him was basically saying that he was Jewish. Right. That's it. That's what we got to know about him. He's an athlete. He's this, he's that. We didn't get to know much about his life. We knew that he had he like some stuff with his father. He mentioned it. That's it. And so I'm like, give me more nuance of him too, so that it can truly be their story, as opposed to,
And so it's meaningful. And so it's meaningful when they end up together. Also, the ending I really wanted was for them to get together and then for Alexandra Shipp to be like, oh, y'all are dating? Well, did you know that Simon earlier, he basically tried to pimp me out to this dude so that he wouldn't tell everyone that Simon was gay. And I'm his one black female friend. And this white guy, tried to pimp me out to this greasy white dude.
Right. And now he wants to have a black partner.
He wants to have a black partner. And then he's like, oh, really? He did that? Word? Okay, yeah, Simon, we're done. I'm going to Morehouse. Bye. And
right. Just be unapologetically black. Yeah, I just wanted something more. But you know what? The thing is too, I realized that I'm in the theater, I'm watching this and I'm like, oh, this is cute or whatever. But I knew it wasn't for me. Like at the end of the day, I knew that this story is not for me as a black queer woman. It's not my story. It's not even like intended to be for me. And the opportunity that it had to be for like to at least kind of like connect more to black queer people was fucked up. So whether it was Brahm, I think his name was Brahm or something like that.
Something like that.
Bram, him not being nuanced, and then the other character who had like the straight hair. I wish I could remember his name. Who was like more femme.
The actor's name is Clark Moore, I believe.
Okay, so but I'm like they had that opportunity with Clark to have more nuance and to have more development because Clark is a badass. Like, was definitely like stood out to me in the film, but those opportunities were not utilized. No. So I knew it was. I'm like, this ain't for us.
Yeah, and I already mentioned this, but it really bothered me the more I sat with it, where it's like, oh, this black femme character who was so great, and I think that there's so much femme shaming among queer men, but you have this black femme character who has a lot of agency over his own life, but he's completely, like I said, desexualized, and the movie doesn't even accept him as a possibility, because like Simon's almost like, well, I could never be with someone that gay, which is a whole other conversation about the whole masculine feminine bullshit dichotomy.
But, because of course who he ends up with is an athlete, who no one would ever think. Yeah. Except
that actor is kind of femme presenting in real life, which I like.
Right.
Mm-hmm. But this is not that. This is the movie, and the movie definitely had him styled in a very specific way.
Black Radical Queer is a ManeHustle Media podcast hosted by Javi and Nicole and produced and edited by Charmaine Johnson. Music is by Young Carts. You can find us on social media on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Black Rad Queer. That's BLKRADQWR. And you can also listen to us wherever you get your podcasts. And be sure to stay connected to us in our discussion group. It's called the BRQ Discussion Group on Facebook, where we will continue the conversations that we start in the podcast.
ManeHustle Media. Turn your side hustle into your main hustle.